Right, David, let's dive straight in. What's tip number one you've got for us today?
Tip number one, and it might be sort of three tips in one, is to do with reading and providing opportunities for students to read in lessons. So something I'm very, very passionate about, and something I try to do frequently in my lessons is have students read, and it stems really from my own sort of personal experiences when I was at school and I wasn't the best reader, and it's sort of that's why I'm really, really passionate about it. So what I'll go through is sort of like how I go about selecting the text that I have my students read, why we do it, and how we do it, and some things that I've found that have worked, and ideas that I've sort of pinched from other people, because I'm a bit of a magpie when it comes to ideas. So the first thing I'd say is this: reading outside of the 6,000 most common used words in the English language, outside those first 6,000, you're more likely to encounter the less frequent words through text. So by the end of secondary school, students should know somewhere in the region of 15,000 to 20,000 words. So if we're not providing opportunities for them to reading our lessons, if we're not providing those opportunities, how are they going to develop them? So the first thing that I would sort of suggest is engaging with your sort of subject communities and finding texts and materials that are really that have been found to be useful for whatever it is you're teaching. I don't think you need to reinvent the wheel. There's no reason why you can't use credible resources such as a textbook, for example, or a book that might be relevant to whatever it is you're teaching. So the first part is about selecting the text. And I really like this idea that Mary Might says about selecting a piece of text that is above the student's pay grade, that's more ambitious than perhaps that they should be able to read at their age. So something that's a year above what they would be expected to read at that point. So once I've selected a piece of text, the first thing that I'm sort of thinking about is I'm going to go through that passage of text that I want students to read, either as a whole class or something that I'm going to read to them, and I'll start by highlighting all of the sort of tier 2 vocabulary, the sort of words that not specific to my subject but are more sophisticated than the tier 1 everyday vocabulary that we use. So we're going to highlight them, and I'm going to either do one of two things. I'm going to pre-teach those words, or I'm going to think about how I can teach as I'm reading through that piece of text. Or I might, if I think the students have encountered them previously, I might look at some activities around how I can check that they've got that prerequisite understanding before we begin reading the text. Because if they haven't got that understanding, everything that comes afterwards, you're just setting the students up to fail. So the first thing is about trying to find out, do they understand it? If not, addressing that, and then we can start to get into the reading. So how I go about making it work is, there are a variety of things that I do. The first is to make the reading accountable. Like, we want to set up activities, and we want to set up things that are going to require the students to engage in the reading. One of my favourite sort of things to do is to have students read to the rest of the class. But I'm aware that for some students, when they first encounter this, it's quite daunting. It can be quite tricky, especially if the text is like littered with words that are either difficult to pronunciate or just things that are really unfamiliar to them. So I go about setting students up with the confidence to do so. So for example, what we will do as a class is we'll engage in things like choral chants. So if, a difficult word like cumulonimbus cloud, for example, I'll have the whole class say that 3 or 4 times. So as a class, I'll go, right class, this is how we pronounce it, cumulonimbus, and I'll display it up on the whiteboard in its sort of phonetic spelling. And I'll go 3, 2, 1, cumulonimbus, and I'll have the whole class chant cumulonimbus. And we'll do that 3 or 4 times, and we'll select one row, and that one row will say that, and I'll go to another row, and I'll begin to narrow it down, so I'll get like sort of 1 or 2 students to get them to say that, so that when that one student that encounters that word in that reading, when they have to say that, they don't feel as awkward, as silly. They haven't been set up to fail. So I like to use choral chants as a way of sort of building that confidence. And for students that are really reluctant when they first start doing this, maybe I'll start off as small as just having them read one sentence, one paragraph, just really sort of just building them up in terms of their level of confidence to read in front of others. The other thing that I've stumbled across more recently, which I wasn't really aware of until I read about it, was Alex Quigley's echo reading, where the teacher reads the body of text first, reads a passage of text, and then the students in pairs will read that back to one another. And the idea being that the teachers modelled the reading, modelled how to pronunciate the words and sort of the pace and all of that sort of stuff, and then the students can read to one another, and again increasing their ability to engage in the text. And then also as the teacher, as they're sort of engaging with that echo reading, it's that chance for you to check for understanding and to listen to what is going on around the classroom. So that's another thing that I do. One of my sort of top tips if you're going to engage in sort of whole class reading is, and it's super simple, is to number if you've got the text that is, so if the text is electronic and you've been able to copy it into Microsoft Word, is to insert line numbers. So you insert line numbers. It's such a time saver. So you say, right, Bobby, I want you to read lines 1 to 6, or I want you to start from line 6, and you're going to keep reading. I'm going to say, right, stop. And then when it comes to the sort of students having to do something with that information, whether it be some sort of question, some sort of activity you want them to do around it, and say, I'm struggling with this question, I'm struggling with this problem. All right, well, have you thought about reading back through lines 10 through to 18, for example? So just read that, really directs the focus, and that was something that I first see Ben Ranson, geography teacher. I don't know if you follow him, Craig, on Twitter. He's superb. But it's just such a simple idea. So to summarise so far, my sort of top tips, because I do this quite a bit. I get lost in my and sort of when we're top tips. Pre-teach the tier 2 vocabulary. Pre-teach the tier 2 vocabulary. Find ways to make the reading accountable. So designing activities around forcing the students to engage in it. If you're going to engage in whole class reading, make sure that any difficult to pronounce words, you pre-teach that, and you engage all students in sort of those choral chants. The kids love it as well as them not feeling as reluctant to read those words. And the echo reading. So teacher reads, teacher models it, and the students read back. So there's this. Yeah, there's just something so enjoyable to hear students read. It just, as I said, I don't know what it is, but there's something really, really enjoyable about it. And when they can begin to make meaning from the text that you're engaging with, it's a joy to see and hear.
Right, this is lovely, this, David. Right, I need to dig into this, because one of the main reasons I started this Tips for Teachers podcast is with my Mr. Bart Maths podcast, I was getting too bogged down in the maths and I wanted to spread it out a bit. And since I've started it, Christopher Such has been on and he's taught me all about this, about reading from a young age, and it's blown my mind. So I'm a bit obsessed with this now. So a couple of reflections, and then I've got a big question for you. So the first is, one thing we often discuss on this podcast is means of participation. And whenever I think of reading out loud, I always think of the kind of one-to-one. So you say to one child, you read this back to me. Yeah. But what I love about what you're saying here is a couple of variations to that. I love this chant, this call and response. I'm a bit obsessed with this just generally as a way of checking for understanding. But I really like that to deal with those tricky words. And the paired reading sounds fascinating as well, whether it's combined with the echo thing, which sounds a fantastic idea. But I really like paired work as a means of kind of rehearsing in front of a kind of pair of friendly ears versus having to read out loud in front of 30 kids. So I love that. And again, as you've said, it gives you an opportunity to wander around the class, get a sense of what's going on and stuff. So that feels really, really powerful. I guess my big question is, obviously you're a geography teacher, but you've got kind of whole school responsibilities and you'll have a good sense of what's going on in other subjects. Is this doable, or do you find maths departments, science departments and so on doing this? And what advice would you have for teachers of those subjects?
So it's a great question, because I have had conversations with people, maths teachers in particular, about I wouldn't want to impose or direct you to do something that doesn't serve the purpose. So, for example, there's not always, I'm not going to have students read around everything I teach with my subject. So, for example, when first encountering how a waterfall forms, it might not be the best way to encounter that new knowledge through reading about it. It might require me with my visualizer and actually a really carefully thought out, well scripted explanation. So I wouldn't try to artificially, force the issue if there's not a genuine purpose behind it. But I can't foresee why there isn't an opportunity in all curriculum areas where reading can't take place. I'm sure in all subjects, and I wouldn't want to speak on behalf of the science community or the maths community. I'm sure there is an opportunity in all subjects if we really carefully think about where we could encounter new information via reading. And what I find quite interesting if you study etymology and the origins of words, and how most of the sort of, or a lot of scientific, mathematical and geographical language derives from ancient Greece. So when we start to unpick the etymology of words and the prefixes, and students can begin to identify those patterns cross-curricular. So those sort of opportunities across curriculum areas, I think, are fascinating and can be very, very rewarding.
Yeah, I agree. You often see etymology as one of the big areas that literacy, I guess, does find its way into the maths classroom. And as you say, the common prefixes and suffixes. But the irony of all of this, David, is that like the questions, I always have my maths hat on. Whoever I'm talking to, I always find a way to wheel it back to maths somehow. So apologies for this. But the irony of all of this is, if you look at exam papers in maths, the questions that kids do the worst on invariably are the ones that have got a bit of a story attached to them in 2 or 3 sentences. So there's definitely a need for this. It's just, I think, from my perspective, it's trying to find what are those kind of texts that we can use that enhance students' understanding. Because what you don't really want to be doing is that reading in maths is just reading these worded problems about, Tom and Jane are sharing sweets in a ratio 3-2. I mean, that's not quite the inspiring literacy, literature I had in mind. It just feels difficult, but I want to do this because I hear from people like you, hear from people like Chris Such and Claire Seeley that this feels an important thing. It's just, for those trickier subjects, you want a way to get it in there that doesn't feel shoehorned, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely.